Welcome to Secrets for an Inspirational Life with Mimi Novic, the place where every heart tells its story. Whether it's inspiration, courage or hope you need, you've come to the right place. Sit back and enjoy the journey with us. Subscribe below to be sure you don't miss future episodes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Secrets for an Inspirational Life. How are you all today? I hope that wherever you are, there are some moments of joy. I hope there is not too much worry going on in your life, and that you are able to find some peace and tranquility amongst all of these crazy things that are going on in the world. And I think to myself sometimes, that subject about worrying about things, and we all do it. I think we're all sort of guilty of worrying about things. But I have to say, it really, and that's from personal experience, it doesn't change anything at all. We have to gain a faith in ourselves, a faith in something greater than ourselves, and also a faith that we are part of something magnificent. Every single day, we are given the chance to try again, to live again. It doesn't matter what circumstances that we find ourselves in. We have a chance. Every moment is a new chance. So let us not despair. Let us not look back too far into the past, nor too far into the future. And let us really take into our hands this present moment and truly live it. Now, I am very excited, as always, and you all know that, about my wonderful guests. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome my guest tonight, who is all the way from the United States. And that is the very interesting and actually enigmatic Jonathan Van Valin. Jonathan is a spiritual teacher and a writer, but that's not all that he does. And he's going to tell us more about that later. One of the main things that Jonathan is going to talk about tonight is that Jonathan actually experienced something quite remarkable, and that is a near-death experience. While he was recovering at home from major surgery, he spent 36 hours experiencing what it was like to die, during which he came to recognize the nature of his deepest self, the secret to overcoming suffering, and what it was like to merge with the divine. Jonathan now travels, writes, creates media, and meets with people to share what he received during his life-changing experience. Today, he shares his amazing journey. Welcome, dear Jonathan.
Thank you, Mimi. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, I'm delighted that you're here. How are you today?
I'm excellent. Most excellent. It's a beautiful winter day here just outside the city of Seattle.
Mm-hmm. Now, where are you exactly? Because you did tell me this earlier, and It sounded quite lovely.
Yes, I'm on Bainbridge Island, which is a 30-minute ferry boat ride from downtown Seattle. This is way up in the upper left-hand corner of the United States. So I'm out in the middle of Puget Sound on Bainbridge Island, which is very forested and riddled with critters like bald eagles, and there's sea lions and harbor seals and poking around in the waters and things like that. And it's a very lovely place to spend a little bit of time, which I often get to do when I come out to my friend's home here.
It sounds so beautiful. And when I listen to my guests and they talk to me about, because they're from all over the place, and as you were talking there, I actually felt I was there with you, because it's so amazing. Technology, for all the things that are wrong with it, I have to say, this is one of the things that is quite wonderful is that here we are, you're on the other side of the planet, and we're talking, we're sharing this moment, and I'm always in awe at that. Now, you have an incredible story.
I'm happy to share it, and just to add to something that you just said about having just a little touch of that experience. If I had to impart a little tiny bit of what I see as some of the purpose of all these sorts of things, is that when you just mentioned that it's almost as though you had a little experience yourself of what it was like to be here. And that, I think, is the magic of connecting with each other, coming together. And I mean that in a broad sense. That's just part of what happens when humans come together. And when I get to speak with people and tell stories and do the writing and media creation and things like that, the only aim ultimately is to offer whomever is being connected with a little touch of a direct experience of their own. So I'm just tickled that you mentioned that in the way that you did. So.
It was as if I was in that story, and it was a magical story. And for that glimmer, that momentary glimmer, I was there, and you took me there. So thank you for that.
Amen. Sure. Delighted.
Now, there's so many things that you do, and so many things. I mean, where does one begin? But one has to begin somewhere. So let us go back.
All right.
A little bit. For me to ask you, where did this whole incredible journey of you nearly dying to where you are now, and that's me condensing it greatly, start somewhere? Because I don't know where to start. Right. I have to say, because really I'm sort of, which is not usual for me, but I'm lost for words, because I know that you have really have gone through some really amazing experiences in life.
Well, there's some truth to that. As far as where to start and how to traverse all of that, that is an enormous amount of landscape. It's also many years, in fact. So just since you brought it up, I suppose we'll start with what you alluded to, and almost dying and whatnot. That is it's a reasonable place to start, but it's true, very true to say that it's not actually the beginning of the story, which is, I think we can all relate to that. Anyone who's gone through something remarkable, interesting, dramatic, or life-changing in some way, well, there was a whole lot of story before that happened too, that led up to it. And that's certainly true with me. But in this particular case, where that story we could sort of arbitrarily begin was, as you alluded, again, there was a surgery. I had a surgery on my throat. It was for a sleep apnea condition, which is quite common, actually, but this is a somewhat unusual solution to it. And in my case, and no need to labor over these particular details, but in my case, that sleep apnea is a condition in which you stop breathing when you sleep. And it's momentary, and it's got all kinds of adverse effects, which is why it's meaningful to solve it, of course. But in my case, the solution was to surgically remove a great deal of tissue from the back of my throat and other things like that. And it's not very often done because it's known as an extremely painful recovery. That's among the reasons, but it's one of the biggest. And so where the story really begins is that I've been released from the hospital. I was in the hospital for 4 days. I'm 29 years old at the time. My father has decided he wants to watch over me carefully in my recovery. And he comes to take me home from the hospital, and he takes me out to the family farmhouse, which is 2 hours east of the city, and somewhat remote, but a great place to hang out and not do much for a while. And I'm simply in his care, under his watchful eye. And the state in which I'm departing the hospital is one in which I can barely speak at all. I can eke out a whispered word at most. And I really can't function very in any meaningful way at all. I mean, I'm destined to do nothing but sort of sit and stare out windows for, we don't know, but quite a few days probably. And the reason that it's an exceptionally painful recovery is that there's a tremendous amount of all the nerve tissue in your body sort of ends up going up through your neck and up into your head, where, you know, and when you go chopping out all kinds of tissue, that disturbs all of that. And it's also true that you have to continue to use this part of your body. You're going to continue to breathe and to swallow and things like that. And so the analogy given me at the time by the surgeon was simply, this is going to be extremely painful. You're going to be one of the few people that know what it's like to break your leg and then have to walk. And
Oof.
that's going to go on for quite a while, because it's going to take, you know, a number of weeks for this to be, you know, heal up. So I am carted out to the farmhouse in a state of absolutely, it's true. It was accurate. It was absolutely knee buckling, mind bending pain. And that's just how, there we go. There was sort of nothing else to say about it other than that's part of the deal. And so there's a lot of reasons why I wasn't going to be doing a whole lot more than staring out windows for a little while. So I'm in his care. This is a farmhouse. There's actually, my father was he was, at the time, he was a part-time attorney and a part-time running an orchard on the farm. That was sort of his passion project. And so he's kind of just pottering around doing farm chores and house chores. And he comes in and checks on me frequently and sees how I'm doing. And usually there's not much to see or even to check on. But where it began to get interesting was about 3 or 4 days into his care. It's the middle of the day, and I literally am simply sitting, and inwardly I experience what I can best describe as simply an inner click. It was a notable moment in which there was literally a click. And instantly in that moment, I recognized that the animating life force within me was beginning to drain away. I was simply beginning to recede. It was instantly clear my body was beginning to die. And immediately upon that click came a startling recognition, which was that the aspect of me that was observing my body dying, that aspect of me was not dying. There was this sort of observer aspect of my consciousness that could observe the body, observe what I thought of as me. And yet it was not, it was still whole. It was still vibrant. It had not been impugned or impacted or affected in any way whatsoever. And so there was another way to put it is that there was this sort of immediate recognition that I and my body were two different things. And I had never experienced that in quite that way before. But it was an extraordinary revelation and an extraordinary freedom, because what it meant was that the pain in that body was not me. And so it was in this moment that my body began to die that I was released from that suffering, and released completely. It wasn't because the pain in the body itself disappeared. It was because there was this experience, this recognition, this absolutely crystal clear recognition, again, that that body wasn't me. Which is a point we'll probably circle back around to another time or two here. But so there was this really, that confers a moment of freedom in that, from that situation in a way that was staggering. It was so staggering, and it wasn't even the most staggering thing. quickly, or sort of immediately, actually, upon that recognition that sort of I and my body were two different things, and the I part wasn't dying. The second recognition immediately was that the draining away of that life force was going relatively slowly. And so it was very clear that, this wasn't imminent in the next couple of hours. This would probably be a day and a half or 2 days before this body really, really, really died. And the freedom of being released from that suffering was so extraordinary and so sort of overwhelming that the notion of being worried just somehow flew out the door. There was just this tremendous experience of, well, there's plenty of time. There's no reason to be worried here at all. None. What is actually me is not even affected by the fact that this body is dying. It's not affected at all. It's not. It is itself not dying, and it's not affected by this body in any way. And yet it is as vibrant and alive and conscious as could be. That's how that it's the seat of the awareness of the body. And that awareness is not impugned in any way. And so if that body's going to take a little while to die, that's fine. I mean, there's plenty of time. If we want to do something about this, we could. There's plenty of time. There's no sense of rush or worry.
And how long did that moment of realization, because I've heard stories of these experiences, was it a case that you were out of your body and were experiencing that separation, I suppose, between soul and body? Were you looking upon your body, or were you still in that awareness of being within your body but somehow separate?
That's a very good question. It's actually very subtle. I'm going to try to give it the answer it deserves. So let me start with this. We are so attuned to our bodies. I mean, we spend virtually every minute of every day, at least that we're awake, feeling like we kind of looking out of our eyeballs. We can look down at our feet, and that's where we look from. That's our perspective, and we operate in the world with the physical senses of this body, of touch and sight and sound and smell and taste, and we have the perceptions of all the thoughts that seem to run through our heads and things like that. And it's very bodily oriented. And the reason I'm mentioning that is that when someone says, well, was it an out-of-body experience? That sort of suggests that all of those perceptual levers, those perceptual senses, are intact. They're just located in a different place. And as if there are sort of two bodies. And the awareness that comes, or that came there and in that moment, was that physical body was actually had an illusory quality to it. That the real seat of reality, the real seat of the sense of me and I, was transcended those physical limitations entirely, which is why the physical limitations of that body, including its literal physical limitations and the pain that was in it, and all the sensations associated with those senses, were no longer a meaningful limitation. And so when someone says, well, did you have an out-of-body experience? Like, were you seeing your body from somewhere else? It's difficult to describe the reality of it, because because if that body is illusory and you're perceiving awareness in a way that doesn't have anything to do with the physical limitations of a body at all, then to say, oh, it's over here, looking over there, begins not to make so much sense. It's It's why I've often preferred the word awareness to consciousness, because the way that experience unfolded was that I was aware. There was awareness, very aware of the world around me, very aware of the body right here that's beginning to die. And if I look out the window and am aware of the countryside outside that window, it still seems as though I'm looking out of roughly the same vantage point as I was before. But it's still exquisitely clear that that awareness is not the same. It's not synonymous with, it's not identified with, it's not physically limited actually by that body. So the funny thing is a question like, well, did you have an out of body experience? So again, I'll put it in a different way. It's sort of like that confers two levels of reality. Like there's the body here and there's the other body here, two different locations. And it sort of accords reality equally to both of them. And this was an awareness that was aware in a way that was unbound by that limitation of space, in the sense that it was impossible to locate it was impossible to find the locus of that awareness. And so it was as though the three dimensions that this body was in and existing in, that limitation simply wasn't meaningful any longer. You can see that it can be very difficult to put these things in words.
No, I understand. I understand you totally.
Yeah.
It is not as if, well, there are two bodies. I understand
Right.
that. It is absolutely the awareness of the state of being that you're in, and I suppose, to put it quite simply, which is, it doesn't do it justice, but it really is, the body is really a vehicle. So, or for the soul, because I always liken it to the fact that the soul is suddenly, although the soul is always in control, I believe, it's not the body. The body is, as I said, the vessel. But I totally agree with you. It's a certain awareness. It's a certain state of being, of consciousness, definitely. And it's not something that I think can be easily understood by anyone unless you have actually been through that experience yourself. It's pretty impossible, I think, to explain it in earthly terms.
It can be quite difficult. One of the finest answers to questions like, what's the deal? What happened? What's the story? Is, hey, come and find out for yourself. Experience it directly, and then you will really know. Otherwise, we can talk about it and we can point to it, and we can sort of cuddle up a little closer to it in a way that's lovely and is frequently helpful. But at the end of the day, it's, you don't, to go back to an analogy we had earlier, it's like talking about getting in the pool is very different than jumping in the pool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Or trying to explain to someone what honey tastes like.
Yes.
You can't. But people can get a sense, I think.
Yeah.
And I think this is the point. It happens to certain people, to some people, and there's a greater reason for that. And also there is an even greater reason why it doesn't happen to everybody. Usually it is always, we'll talk about this a little bit after this part of the story, but it has such a profound effect on people that have gone through this type of experience. Their life, in a way, is their second life. It's never the same. But I'm interested, Jonathan, did you experience going to another place, or was it just there where you were?
Yeah, let me address that. I'm going to do it using one of the words that you just used yourself. I'm going to borrow it and turn it upside down a little, actually. And that was the word soul. And it's true that in this immediate recognition, there was, as I've attempted to describe, another way I could describe it was that as I was aware of this body and aware of it being a separate and frankly illusory projection, essentially, that in that there was still very much a sense of individuatedness in that moment. It was sort of like the individuated sense of self had been released from the limitations of the body, but it was still an individuated sense of self. And it was in this state of awareness that could look upon the situation and look upon the body. That individuated sense of self was clearly not dying at all. It was not impugned by this bodily situation in any way whatsoever. And because I keep saying it was as a result, it was completely freed from the suffering. One of the points I like to make about that is that pain and suffering can be two different things. There was still pain in that body, and it was a recognizable experience that was occurring. The pain had not itself disappeared. It was just that there was no longer any sense of suffering about it, because it wasn't me. It wasn't mine. I didn't have to own it. I didn't have to tell a story about how horrible it was, because it wasn't. It was still there. It just wasn't mine. And so there was a release from the suffering of it. But I think that's a lot of often how people think of souls. Like, well, I have a soul. I have this non-corporeal aspect of me, but it's still an individuated sense. It's me. It's just non-bodily. It's bigger than that. It's sort of like increasing the size of the sense itself. I have my limited bodily self, and if I think of myself as a soul now, I have much bigger boundaries. That's sort of, I think, the way people often think about souls. And in that particular moment, I could relate with that kind of understanding to it. But the second experience that came flooding in immediately, also upon all the rest of this happening, it sort of all happened simultaneously, frankly, was that even that individuated sense of self, even if it was a non-corporeal sense of self, began to fade. It began to dissolve. It began to, that individuated sense of self felt as though it was beginning to lose its individuality and merge into this sort of incomprehensibly large vastness that contained absolutely everything at all. And that began to be a sort of revelation and a freedom that was even greater than had immediately been conferred by being released from that bodily suffering in the first place. And
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I could circle right back to it if you like.
What came to me strongly as you spoke is this sense of being limitless.
Yes.
A sense of nothingness, to suddenly becoming limitless, to becoming everything,
yes,
and beyond everything. A sort of a union,
yes,
within the cosmos.
And even beyond the physical limitations of the cosmos.
Yeah.
You're right. And in this case, this was gentle. This was as every molecule of life force drained away, that sense of merging into that infinite vastness increased. It was exquisitely gentle, and happening at this sort of gentle, measured pace. And so it wasn't being thrust into something. It was it was an awareness of that. I could see in that moment that I was beginning to merge with the infinite. And that does mean that sense of individuated self was being sort of chipped away and falling away a little more, a little bit more. As my body died a little bit more, that sense of merging with the infinite happened a little more and a little more. And this is the part in many people's journeys, and I think in many the listeners, when they think, oh no, is that what really means to die, to lose this self, this sense of self? And there can be a little bit of frankly, a little panic about it. But what I would emphasize and literally share with anyone listening is that, again, this is emerging into the infinite. This is emerging into all, absolutely all with a capital A. And if something is absolutely all, then it can't be missing anything. And as such, there cannot possibly be any sense of loss. And if you can imagine in any way what it might be like to experience a moment in which there could not possibly be any sense of loss of any kind, then it sort of floods in naturally that how could there possibly be any sense of fear or any sense of loss or any sense of things not being perfectly perfectly perfect.
I always liken it, Jonathan, to the drop of water ultimately merging with this ocean of unity.
Yes.
The ocean is contained in the drop is contained in the ocean, and there is no separateness.
Right, very much.
And I think bringing it back to life and your talk about suffering,
mm-hmm.
A lot of suffering that goes on is this sense of feeling isolated and distanced from the source.
Yes, and that can take so many forms. I mean, in the end, if I had anything to say in any way about spiritual teaching, one way of summing it up would be that the spiritual journey is a journey from separation to wholeness. And I mean that on a metaphoric level. I mean it on a very real, ordinary, practical, daily level. I mean it on every possible level.
Yeah.
Including, when one gets to a certain point in the journey, even that sense of an individuated, personal, separated self can, in fact, begin to soften and dissolve. And it's a part of it. It's a overwhelmingly natural part of the journey that absolutely every seemingly separated soul is going to approach at some point in some way. And there are going to be a million smaller steps along the way. For me, this was one of them.
And that experience in itself lasted a certain amount of time.
Yes.
During that experience, was your father aware that you were in this state?
That's a good question. He was not. He had no idea. So it's the middle of the afternoon. I've started to die in that same moment, as I've tried to describe in length and breadth here. The entire experience is flipped completely on its head. It went from an experience of literally being pretty much pure hell to one of the most extraordinary, exquisite, beatific, overwhelming peace that I could never have fathomed without experiencing it directly, in which some of the most knee-buckling, mind-bending pain is rendered irrelevant. And I just simply in a state of such overwhelming peace that in which there is nothing that appears to be wrong, nothing as a result. If everything is as I attempted to describe it, how could there possibly be a need for something to change?
Yeah.
And that was how I felt. I mean, it began to be simply a stunning. I was essentially just sitting in absolute awe. And as always, throughout these days, there would come a point eventually where my father would pop in and have a look and make sure I was all right, pop back out and keep doing whatever he was doing. And I'm pretty sure, I'm quite sure that was the case. He'd pop in and I might look at him. I didn't have anything to say.
So you were conscious at this point. You were not
Absolutely.
Unconscious. Okay.
Absolutely. Entirely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I was sitting around in the living room. That's what I was doing. And that's it, really. I couldn't, there was certainly no sense on my part whatsoever that there was a problem. Never mind the fact that I was very clear that the body was dying. That was very clear. And I'll come back to that point in a moment when we get to the part where medical professionals confirmed it. But I also knew that I couldn't possibly explain anything to my father. Like, even if I could talk better than I was literally physically capable of at the time, I was barely capable of talking at all. There's no way I could have looked at my father and said, "Hey, Dad, I'm dying. And you know what? It's fine." In fact, this is one of the most extraordinary experiences I've ever had ever. I'm not even sure I'd give this back if I had the opportunity to. This is literally one of the most extraordinary things that's ever occurred to me. Also, by the way, Dad, my body, you know what? Kind of irrelevant. The me part, not dying at all. My body, it's dying, but that's fine. I couldn't say that. I couldn't have put any of this into words at the time. And then if I took one more step and said, "Oh, also, by the way, you know what? I'm pretty much merging into the overwhelming, ineffable allness that appears to be just." Do we have a better word for divine? The divine than that? Do we have a better word than God for that? I don't know that we do. I don't know what to call it. But anyway, I'm merging into that. All's well, Dad. Go ahead and do what you got to do. Like that, I couldn't make sense of any of that. Nor would he have been able to hear it. God bless him. I mean, he just, that would have made no sense to him whatsoever. So I said nothing, which I was delighted by. And, that's just how the day went. And so, yes, this experience, as I've described it, lasted the rest of the day, lasted into the night. The experience of this whole thing had, I had hardly slept, because that's hard to sleep when you're just shattering pain. And so sleep had been a very, I hardly slept much. But given the change of the state of affairs, there was a thought that goes through my head like, hey, I might actually be able to go to sleep. That sounds awesome. This is probably great. And I do. And so that, I eventually go to bed and I wake up periodically through the night. And every time I do, I check in with this experience. And, I ask myself internally, am I still dying? Yes. Yeah, it's actually speeding up. Yeah, that life force is draining away faster. But as that life force is draining away faster, so is the merging with the divine speeding up as well. They're in perfect concert with each other. And that remains exquisitely peaceful, in that there is a well-quoted line that many know from a very popular source that describes it as the peace that passes all understanding. And what I am fond of being able to gently remind people of is that just because something is beyond someone's understanding does not in any way mean that it's beyond their experiencing. That's
Yeah.
what's at the core of that little phrase.
Mm.
These are things that can and will be experienced, even if they're difficult to put into linear, rational terms. But that's why experience can be so powerful, and words, although important and have their place,
Yeah,
direct experience
absolutely.
always trumps the words. And so, in any case, so I go through this night. I wake up the following morning. Gosh, am I still dying? Yeah, I am. It's speeding up quite a bit now, actually. And I also, there's so much time that's passed. There's this sort of reflection for me in which I basically I can see that, and I'm saying this metaphorically, but I'm very aware of this threshold, let's call it. And, it's easy for me to project my mind into that being a doorway, a literal threshold. And, the walking through that doorway into the, that's laying this body completely aside and, going to the other side, as we say. And that is, it's simply an open option for me. It's very obvious and clear that I can go through that doorway. What's also clear is that I do actually have a choice. I can actually opt not to if I want, which seems a little surprising because when you are faced with the most beatific peace and perfect wholeness, it could seem like a funny decision to want to turn around and go in the other direction. And that was a point of reflection that was with me for many, many years. But as I began to look at that doorway, look at that threshold and so on and so forth, I can't really explain it other than it was simply a feeling within that just said, I think I'm not really going to go through the doorway. I'm not done here yet. There's stuff I got to do. I don't even know what it is. Actually, I'm not really clear on that at all. I'm just not. I think I should just. I think I'm not done, and I should stick around. And so that was just a sort of a point of reflection throughout the next day. And then again, in the middle of the next afternoon, there's another point where my father comes in and kind of looks at me. But this time I see him really squint. I see his eyes like squints up and looks at me carefully. And he says, "Jonathan, I think something's not right. I think we better load up the car and head back over to the hospital." And I've sort of been reflecting on this whole notion of, well, am I going through the doorway or not? He says, "Well, I think we should load up the car." And I think, yeah, sure. Yeah, you know what? I am on board with that. I mean, merging into the divine is the most exquisite thing I could possibly imagine, and so on. But I'm sort of, a feeling of like there was 51% of me that thought, you should stay, and 49% thought, this is exquisite. Why? Why not go through that doorway? But there was just that little bit tips it in the balance. And so when he says this to me, I think, yeah, great, we'll go. Let's go. Let's go to the hospital. I think we're going to turn this around. And I dawdle. I take the longest time to get my act together, and I'm not in a hurry at all. And the reason I'm not in a hurry is I still can't see that there's anything amiss about the situation. There's no sense of urgency. There's no sense of tragedy in me. There's no sense whatsoever that something terrible is happening, that the body dying is a problem. It's just, I'm just going through this experience. And so there's no urgency on my part. And that's why I'm sort of dawdling around. But we eventually do get going. It's a 2-hour drive. I go back to the same hospital at which the original surgery was performed. I'm taken to the ER, and immediately upon my admittance, these doctors confirm that my body is dying. And it is dying for the dumbest reason on the planet, which is dehydration. And that's the deal. Why I was released in the hospital in the first place days before, in a state in which I was essentially incapable of eating and drinking, I don't know. I had made some attempts. The act of eating something was was a level of pain that I just literally cannot put into words. And so it just didn't happen much. And it was sort of like nobody noticed, including me, but I hadn't really been taking in any liquids either. And so it was very simple. My body was dying of dehydration. So dumb. And these ER docs also, it's an easy problem to fix too. So they figure this out and they stick me with an IV and immediately dump a liter of saline solution into my veins. And the minute that IV is connected, all of this begins to reverse. And that life force begins to, I feel it instantly. It begins to flow back in. And that merging with the infinite begins to reverse as well. And it's just instantly clear that I am going from this state of awareness, and I'm going to come more back into that bodily framework. And that's simply exactly what happens. And so within minutes, all of this begins to reverse. They keep me for a couple hours to observe to make sure I'm still all right, and so on. But they release us soon enough. And again, later that evening, we're taking a 2-hour drive back to the farmhouse, and I have a greater chance to reflect on some of these things. And I think of one of my major points of reflection is to my grandfather, who had a very graceful passing. And I didn't really understand it as a younger person, but given the experience I had just gone through, I felt that I had an enormous amount of insight into some of his own experience that well, it was just very moving to me. And overall, I was actually glad to be coming back. There was something visceral about that choice to not go through that doorway that still felt right, even though it still meant refusing to go towards the overwhelming peace of the infinite. And yet that still felt right. And for that, I felt good. And because of that, it felt like every step in my, the recovery, so was sort of a happy achievement. And so I was back at the farmhouse for 3 solid weeks. And it took that long to heal up. And so 3 weeks later, after all of this, I'm ready. I go back to my own home. I go back to my job, and I kind of get back in the swing of things. And something I've often alluded to is that I've sometimes said to people that this experience, as extraordinary as it sounds, and it was extraordinary, at first, it didn't really move my needle as much as people might think. And I think the reason for that is I just simply, as sort of mind-blowing, we could call it, as mind-blowing as it was at the time, there was this part where, it did gently come to a close, and I kind of began to get back into regular life. And I wanted to get back to regular life with a, kind of with a vengeance. And there were moments where I thought, wait a minute, I remember what it was like to think this body was virtually irrelevant. But here in the scope of warp and weave of regular life, it seems very important, and it should be protected and cared for and terribly, valued and defended vigorously, and that sort of thing. And those were all, I couldn't quite, that was such a contradiction to what I had seen and understood and felt and experienced, that I simply couldn't reconcile it. I couldn't reconcile it. And it was a solid decade of going through additional experiences that brought some of the aspects of this NDE experience back over time. That it took many years actually to sort of infuse its truths in me in a way that made them really truly accessible. And I actually ended up having to go through some other really pivotal experiences that really were the seat of the ultimate transformation, in which the experiences I'm describing felt as if they settled in permanently. And eventually just, the way I looked upon the world and see it and experience it really is completely different than it was before. But that was a long process. And one of the things that brought that process along was having to be faced with other instances of death and dying. So when I was, and there was a handful, there was a bunch actually that I didn't seek these things, but just life prompted them. Or family member is dying, a dear friend is dying, things like these. And eventually my father's dying. And I'm actually the task of determining when to tell the medical professionals to unhook the machines and let it die has fallen to me. And I have to make that call. And and I felt honored by it, actually. And I knew that there was all the other family members that were around me at the time, including his wife. It probably sounds funny, but I never spoke about these things to them. And it was in part because I could, then I still couldn't figure out how to put them into words. But even if I thought I could put them into words, I was also convinced that they simply wouldn't be able to hear it. It's a very strange thing to look at someone and say, well, your body's actually an illusion and you are a non-corporeal awareness that has no limitations in a way that is equal to the divine. Like, sure, that's a mouthful, but it's like the words can be understood, but can the person actually wrap their minds around what that really means? I simply found myself convinced that that wasn't possible, and that may have been, a limitation of my own at the time, in its own right. But when this moment comes, when this responsibility falls to me, what I end up feeling is deeply, deeply, deeply honored, because I know that I'm the only family member that knows essentially where my father is about to go. And for that, I cannot help but celebrate with. And so when it comes time to make that choice, make the decision, and that event does come, that moment does come, it was simply a moment of some of the deepest loving solidarity with my father I've ever had. And again, in a way that I've tried to describe before, in that sense, it wasn't even a tragedy. It was a loving moment of union that simply passes understanding. It's overwhelming peace and loveliness.
And that's why I said I'm not usually lost for words, but it's an incredible story. And Jonathan, it's something that I totally understand.
I see that.
I totally understand it. And I wanted to ask you is, when you came back, so to speak, and I suppose enveloped the earthly career, so to speak. I always think that we're here on a job, all of us, whether we know it or not, whether we accept it or not. You can't be the same, because it's like that old saying, which is so true of all the old mystics of old. It's dying before you die.
Yes, in my case, somewhat more literally than most people.
Yeah. And it's people that go through that. I think every person that I've spoken to about this, and I can really, truly identify with it, is that their life is never the same. And you don't look at things the same. You don't feel things the same. In a way, it is the second life and the real life. And your choice, as you said, that 1% that made the difference between leaving and staying, and having that choice. This is the thing. Is it really our choice? Was it really your choice?
Very good question. That's a very good question, because that question points directly and ferociously at the heart of the question of, well, what is that I that appears to be making the choice?
Yeah.
And when we think of it as being that small self, that sense of an individuated self, could if we pick it apart as much as we can, that sense of an individuated, egoic, separate self, the one that we usually feel like is barking in our heads most of the time, if we pick it apart, we end up seeing that the seat of that particular kind of decision seems to be beyond it.
Yes, it's not our thoughts. I think it goes beyond thought. It goes beyond the ego, which is obviously bound to the earth for all its worldly desires and pleasures of eating and drinking and whatever, having a good time. It's beyond that. It's beyond thought. It's a state of being sublime. And really, you choosing, or it being chosen for you, in reality, I think one day you'll find out, if you haven't already. But although we have free will, I think there is a greater will beyond that.
Yes, and that's another thing that can be kind of fascinating and interesting and difficult to pick apart. But where it seems like things are in flow and in harmony is when what seems to be our personal will is in harmony with that great will. And I say it that way because because it's possible for those things to seem like they oppose each other sometimes, but when they are in harmony with each other, it feels like we're choosing. But at the time that we're making those choices, it's also somehow clear viscerally that what we're experiencing really is the movement of the greatest will. And so it's as though they merge. It's another one of the ways in which two becomes one.
Yeah, 100%. And ultimately, everything is one.
Indeed.
Every other number that goes beyond, but again, it's a nothing, because ultimately everything comes down to one.
Yeah.
1 plus 1 is 2. 2 plus... So this joining is really, I suppose, us dissolving into the one.
It is. It's a sort of, if we look at that in worldly terms, we could say that anytime we come together in that way, in a way that's loving, essentially, that's an outward picture of the otherwise inward condition, the inward awareness of what's ultimately one.
Yes.
It's a way in which it gets demonstrated. Probably, well, first of all, as I've said, this initial near-death experience, as dramatic as it sounds, and it was dramatic, obviously, but my response to it at the time, as I got back in the swing of the regular world, was mostly to bury it, as I said, because I couldn't reconcile my worldly experience with the experience of being so far beyond the limitations of this world. I couldn't reconcile it. And so I mostly buried it. It's like I shoved it aside and just tried not, I didn't look at it. But the course of life events kind of kept forcing me to reconcile with it, kept forcing me to return to it. I couldn't forget it. It was indelibly in my consciousness, but I did not speak of it in any way whatsoever for, over a decade. And what it really did was I never had identified particularly as a spiritual seeker, even though I could look at my past and see some sort of underpinnings of that sort of thing for sure, but I never thought of it in those terms. But after this point, I'm going to skip a lot of experiences in history here, but after this point, it did sort of the act of beginning to reconcile these things. And for instance, to reconcile that notion, that feeling inwardly of like, well, there is a reason to be here. It was the right choice to opt to stay. Well, why? What am I supposed to be doing here? And I didn't have an answer for that. All I knew is that what I was doing at the time was definitely not it. So there was simply this feeling of like, I know there's something there. There's something. I can't even put my finger on it. But I know that what I am literally doing with my daily, existence is not it. And that sort of began to drive what you would have to eventually call a spiritual search. Because it was just the questions of, all right, what is this? What's really true? What am I doing here? What is the point of all this? The deepest possible existential questions, which I had asked in the past, but kind of given lip service to more than at this point where it was like, this was getting to be serious, really serious. And that's really, in a way, I could say that's what describes the decade after this NDE, and that the search and the question, the seeking for those questions began to rise in a way internally to me that began to be so ferocious that it just became, frankly, all consuming. And to the point that within a couple of months of my father's death, a couple of months after his death, I completely walked away from regular life. And I sold my half of the business that I'd been running. I sold my car. I said goodbye to the lovely girlfriend, gave the keys to my home to someone I barely knew. This had been a long time coming. This was not a snap decision. This had been something I'd sort of been, leaning towards, it seemed like, for quite a long time. But, and I simply left, and I left simply and only because that internal drive to resolve those questions had become so overwhelmingly ferocious that I just absolutely could not do this. And it sounds a little dramatic, and it sounds, like kind of a weird thing to do to most functioning grown-ups who are leading busy lives. And that's fair, but I could not do it. And what I was going towards in seeking the answers to those kinds of questions obviously relates back profoundly to that NDE. In fact, the first time I ever paid close attention to my own story was during this period in which I did leave. I literally just left. I went from Seattle, Washington to a tiny little village in the Western Highlands of Guatemala, where I did not speak the language. There were no roads. You had to take a boat. It was extraordinarily remote. And I sat and I journaled for months. And this story of the NDE, among many other stories, only came into being because during that journaling process, I decided to write it down. And that was the first time I ever told it. I didn't tell it to anyone. I just wrote it on paper. And that was to write it on paper like that was, and all the rest of it was an act of trying to sort through it. It was a deconstructive act. If you were a good Advaitic seeker, you would have said I was doing self-inquiry. And that's certainly true. It was sort of self-inquiry on steroids, extremely intense and very, very focused. I had absolutely nothing to do other than write. So that's what I did for months. And anyway, the I sort of skipped past a number of points that you raised that I kind of intended to come back to, and frankly, I've even forgotten at least one or two of them now. But I've said a great deal about merging into the infinite and losing an individuated sense of self in favor of an overwhelming allness, and those are things that can sound really out of reach to ordinary people that are trying to make their lunch and go to work and send their kid to school. And I want to bring it back around a little, to those things, because we're all in this ordinary world doing those ordinary things like tying our shoes and putting gas in our cars and so on. And the thing is that if I go back to that overwhelming experience, and we'll just return there for a moment and see what it's like to even imagine for a moment that if there is a sense of absolutely overwhelming allness that is missing nothing, there cannot be anything missing. And as a result, there cannot be any sense of lack or want or need. And if you imagine what it's like for even just a moment to experience, what would it be like to feel absolutely no sense of lack or want or need? Then it's extraordinarily peaceful. There certainly couldn't be anything wrong. Nothing would need to be changed. Nothing, frankly, even would need to be done. It's all right here, right now. And as a result, it's essentially that there couldn't even be any sense of fear then. What could there be to fear? And again, that's among the reasons why it could be so extraordinarily peaceful and seem kind of quiet. There's not a whole lot there to make a whole lot of noise once the fear is gone. And it's also a place from which then it couldn't possibly seem natural to do anything other than be kind or forgiving or loving, because what else would there be to do? It's how one kind of comes around to this feeling like, well, our natural default setting, the only natural default setting that's even available then is something that's overwhelmingly loving. And here's the thing about that. And this is what's going to bring it around to putting gas in the car, taking your kids to school, is that there's no one on this planet, even the most troubled, that hasn't in some small way, in some way, bumped into an experience of love. That is something that we can't be here on this planet without some sort of a touch of it. And yes, in some it seems to be more covered over than others. And there's a wide range of things, but there's no one that is untouched by it completely. No one. It's just part of our deepest nature. We couldn't be here on the planet at all without it. And it really, that is what connects us back to this. And so when someone might think, oh, these experiences are too out there, they're just, I can't fathom them, I can't wrap my head around them, it's too mind-blowing, it's too much. How could this even be true or real? Well, if you've ever had a loving thought ever in your mind, ever, then you have in fact touched it. And that's one of the greatest, most beautiful commonalities that we share as human beings.
I agree with you, Jonathan, completely. And as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, it must be that 1% that actually was this divine love that brought you back to Earth to help others now. because
I'm about to tear up. I'm about to tear up myself right here, right now. But I can't imagine a better explanation than what you just said.
I feel it, you know. As you were talking, there was this sense of harmony, of alignment, and this merging of complete understanding, of complete love. And you felt that love, whatever you had gone through in those hours, in that great despair of the suffering, as you say, and the suffering disappeared.
Yeah.
And your emergence into this divine ocean of love. You must have agreed, even maybe you don't remember, but you must have agreed to come back and to share that love. And I think that's what made the difference, is that your love for people and your greatness of your soul made that deal in effect with the divine to come back and to teach others, to remind them of this beautiful love.
It's I don't know. I mean, I can't say that I have a visual memory of making that agreement. I just knew it was the right thing to come back, and that I spent the next bunch of years rather slowly discovering the directions I should be going in. And the more I listened carefully within, the more the direction, that direction revealed itself. And I had to go through many, many, many other experiences, challenges, all kinds of things, of course.
But that is
but
the
I
past.
cannot imagine there being
Yeah.
any other better reason for being here either. It's why today on this podcast, I can't imagine doing anything better with my time today than having this lovely conversation with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes me smile because I'm overjoyed that you came and that you shared your story. And I know we wanted to talk about so many other things, but that's why you must come back again to share.
Happy to do that.
You have to. You must come back again. And you have left me with a profound sense of memory, of sweetness, and a memory of many things that have happened in my life. And I'm sure for the people out there also, you have touched upon something that is part of all of us, and that is being born, living, dying. How many of us really live? And that's the most important thing, is if anything, not only are you reminding people, myself included, of course, about love and about life. And that through being selfless, through this magnificent love that is installed in every single one of us, and that's why we recognize it. We can only recognize that because it's a reflection of us. And you so beautifully put it that, you know, we are part of something far greater. The divinity is within us. And I want to thank you for reminding me and for reminding everybody out there, and for really sharing this astonishing story that I hope helps people out there to love, to live, and not to be afraid.
Amen. Sometimes it's hard to find words when it seems like
Yes.
the best vessel for holding such peace is so often silence.
Yes.
And if any of this, I can see in you, and in probably many of the people listening, if it seems like any of this has evoked within you a sense of quietude, even the kind of quietude that would be difficult to put into words, then we have managed to touch exactly what we've been talking about. So,
Indeed.
Amen. Amen to you and to that stillness and that quietude and that love.
Yeah. Beautiful, really. And
we'll do it again sometime.
Let's do it again. Let's do it again. Indeed, because you are such a fascinating person, Jonathan, and you have many stories to share. And as you know, I'm a lover of stories. And I'm sure there's so much you can teach us, much, much more. But in the meantime, for everybody out there that wants to contact you or find out more about your work, where can they do that?
That's a good idea. That's great. The easiest way to do it is at my little website, little corner of the web, which is called assistthespirit.com. And you can find some of my work there, and writings and small video things and all kinds of things. And you're welcome to write me a note if any of this, if anyone writes me, I will write you back. And you're welcome to initiate that conversation. So, as I said a moment ago, I don't really have anything better to be doing with my time than these kinds of things. And I'm delighted to do them. So.
Oh, and I'm so honored, really, that you came and shared your moments of your life in this hour or so with myself and everybody out there. It has really been a beautiful, beautiful talk.
I'm glad you think so, Mimi. I feel
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Give my regards to Seattle and your magical place of all your wonderful, oh my goodness, your seals and all things there that are beautiful. And I hope one day you come to England again, and you can share, we can show you around and share some beautiful moments again.
That sounds delightful. And there's a non-zero chance that happens in the fall, but we'll keep you all posted.
Wonderful, wonderful. Have a beautiful day, because I know it's day there.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, it would be wonderful to have you back again.
I look forward to it, Mimi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Jonathan Van Valin. What an extraordinary story, and a wonderful reminder to live every moment of our life. Thank you for joining me as ever. I really appreciate it. And I hope you will join me in the next episode. Until next time, look after yourselves, and sending you wonderful love.
Thank you for listening to Secrets for an Inspirational Life, brought to you by your host, Mimi Novic. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast, and see you in the next episode. For more information about Mimi Novic and her books, music, and inspirational work, take a look at her website, www.miminovic.co.uk.